Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. I want to start a series of podcasts over the next few weeks that focus on some of the core issues of relationships. Now this time I'm not going to focus necessarily purely on relationship with oneself, but I'm going to be actually looking at relationships with others, especially intimate relationships. And there's a number of issues that I want to discuss over the next few weeks that are extremely important. And yep, it will contain some of the usual things like issues about intimacy, communication, bonding, contact, all those sorts of things. And I was going to sort of do it in a bit of a sequence, but I actually, after having a few days working with a number of men on one particular issue that I think is crucially important to understand, especially in many respects in our society, in our culture at the moment. And it's always been, in a sense, a part of the romantic landscape, but for some reason or another, I'm seeing this in very young people, but I'm also seeing it in older, more supposedly mature men. And the issue is fundamentally that of jealousy. Now, let me start this podcast with a little bit of a sort of story. And the story is about Othello, a Christian Moor living in Venice who's achieved significant success. And before the play starts, it's written by William Shakespeare, a master of human psyche, at least in understanding it. I'm not sure what he was like in of himself, but he certainly understood human beings exceptionally well because his plays represent that. So let me get back to Othello. A Christian Moor, highly successful, living in Venice, married to the gorgeous Desdemona. And he's fundamentally lived a life as a soldier, but he's got a free and open nature. Now, the villain of the story is a guy called Iago, who is Othello's ensign. In the old days, it was also a job known as an ancient or standard bearer. And he's about 28 years old in the story, and his reason for wanting to see Othello's demise or downfall is that he's been passed over for promotion to lieutenant. But throughout the play, we're never quite sure where he's really coming from around that. But he is exceptionally manipulative and destructive. Now let me talk a little bit about Desdemona, because on the surface she appears as the daughter of a Venetian senator, Brabantio, and Desdemona and Othello have secretly married before the play begins. And on the surface, she's sort of stereotypically pure and meek, the classical sort of romantic damsel. But Desdemona has features of being an extremely determined and self-possessed young woman, capable of defending her marriage, but also getting into some fairly bawdy stuff with Iago, and finds herself having to respond ultimately with dignity to Othello's growing incomprehensible jealousy. So the play Othello is fundamentally about that green-eyed monster jealousy. Okay, so how is that operating in that play? Now, to some degree, I venture most of us as men can appreciate, or have at least had one or a few experiences of jealousy on occasion, but for some men, jealousy is a persistent demon in their soul when they're in a relationship. Okay, and I'll get to perhaps why that is, but let me come back to the sort of feature of jealousy in Othello. As I said, it's the central theme fundamentally in Othello's conflicts. And Othello becomes suspicious of Desdemona, and Iago is very quick to foster this. Now, coming back to the idea that he's pissed off because he didn't get promoted, his observation is, I'm worth no worse a place. But he's also very clear that he can manipulate Othello's insecurities. And he does have insecurities. As I said, he's a black man in a white Christian society, and even though he's achieved a fundamental level of success that many of his fellow Moors at the time would not have even dreamt of. So, for lots of reasons, particularly the getting passed over by full promotion, Iago starts poking the stick. He starts tending to the embers of that fire of jealousy. And unfortunately, Othello goes for it. To the point where Othello ends up killing the love of his life, Desdemona. So not only just an interesting story, but one that's beautifully crafted in terms of characterization and themes within the story. And so let me get you to reflect a little bit on the things that I've said so far. But in doing so, let me come back to something that I've found, over the years from time to time that I think is a little disturbing, and that is the idea that for some reason or another, some people perceive that jealousy can be a healthy aspect in a relationship. And I'm going to challenge that idea completely. And there's several reasons for that. Firstly is that jealousy as an insecurity, in my experience, has a tendency to grow. It evolves into a deeper and deeper dark expression. And I'm loath to use the word emotion because jealousy consists of a number of different emotions. Okay, so it also is based fundamentally on my experience within myself in my relationship, in that I'm insecure. And that insecurity leads to me fearing the loss of the person that I love. And I'm, for this podcast, going to stick to intimate relationships. Now, why am I insecure? Well, a lot of the time, the story that I'm telling myself is that, maybe I'm just not quite good enough to deserve this person that I'm in love with. And when she finally finds out how flawed I am or how bad I am, she's going to move on. Someone else be more attractive. Maybe has more money, more status. But the risk is always there for me to have to face the pain of her no longer being in my life, or him for that matter. But let me come from the male perspective here. So one of the things that I will tend to do is I will watch her very closely. I will hover around. And in some instances, as I said, this gets darker and darker and darker. So in the days of mobile phones and social media and so on, one of the things that I see, some men begin to engage in is stalking. So I'm tracking my partner to know where she is and when she's there, and I'm going to draw certain conclusions. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of times those assumptions or conclusions that I'm drawing are absolutely completely inaccurate. They're based on my own irrational belief about myself, and the anxiety that I'm dealing with as a result. And as I've spoken before in other podcasts, one of the things that anxiety tends to do is make us think more negatively, more pessimistically, and then we tend to catastrophize. And so in this instance, one of the aspects cognitively that emerges in this context is that I'm going to start obsessing and ruminating about, does she love me, does she not, who's she with, who may she find interesting, who may she find more interesting than me. So the idea that there is such a thing as healthy jealousy, just from that aspect alone, is seriously flawed. Now, that doesn't mean that if I'm in a monogamous relationship, I'm not going to, necessarily feel terrifically happy with my partner flirting with somebody else. However, if I'm hurt by that, I need to talk to her about it. Now, alternatively, that conversation may not be about her flirting with somebody else, but how I'm feeling hurt, that in that context I may be feeling rejected or abandoned or, not being held in esteem. Okay, now that's a different conversation to accusing my partner of being overly flirtatious and wanting to spark up a relationship with somebody else. So the other emotion that comes up that forges into this thing called jealousy then is anxiety and fear, but also anger and rage, and this escalates. And one of my main concerns often when people show varying degrees of jealousy is, where is this going? What's actually happening here? And so the issue for a lot of people in that situation is, rather than looking at their partner's behaviour, they should be looking at their own relationship with themselves and their own, what's happening for them emotionally, all right? Their sense of insecurity, they're not dealing effectively with feelings of hurt, not dealing effectively with feeling frustrated, angry, and enraged, and then the constant and persistent behaviour that fuels all of this together. So, who's prone, in that sense, to that type of reaction? Who's prone to jealousy? Now, many, many years ago, some researchers, Bowlby and Ainsworth, came up with a model of attachment, and I'm going to go into that in much, much more detail at a later point. And so we talk about people who are ambivalently attached, and all of this starts off in childhood. And I'm going to, I'm going to expand that model, okay? But for the time being, I'm going to focus on 3 attachment styles. The first one is the ambivalence. So when I'm ambivalent about relationships, I'm sort of reluctant actually to become too close to others. Now, the downfall to that is I'm never going to be feeling really secure in the relationship, nor am I going to sense security from the other person. I'm going to be obsessed with the idea that my partner doesn't love me, and I'm going to become emotionally distraught either with the fear of the relationship ending or when the relationship eventually does end. Now, the other attachment style that Bowlby and Ainsworth talk about is avoidant, okay? And again, in that style, as an adult, I am going to have problems with intimacy, getting close. I'm going to invest very little emotion in social or romantic relationships because it doesn't quite compute for me, okay? And so I'm going to be very much a bit of a closed shop. So I'm going to be unable or unwilling to share my thoughts and feelings with other people. I'm going to stick to my role and what I do, but I'm not going to let people in. So the third attachment style that Bowlby and Ainsworth talk about is secure attachment, okay? So if I'm securely attached and I can form securely attached relationships to myself and others, I'm going to be able to have trusting, lasting relationships. I'm generally going to have good self-esteem, good sense of self-value. I'm going to be comfortable with sharing my feelings, and if I need to, I'm going to reach out for support. In other words, I'm going to be able to have healthy, well-adjusted relationships without the overtones or the undertones of fear, anxiety, and insecurity. So it's in that context that I want to stress the point that I do not see how there can be a healthy form of jealousy. I've worked with too many couples and too many individuals to see any form of jealousy escalate or really inhibit the capacity to communicate effectively, physically and emotionally, intellectually, without there being some sense of ownership and threat if I perceive that I could lose that person. It's about really accepting unconditionally the other person. Jealousy completely interferes with that. Why do I need to be jealous? Yes, there is a different conversation about feeling hurt as opposed to jealous. It's the jealousy that I'm concerned about. So from my perspective, no, there is no such thing as healthy jealousy, so don't be persuaded into that. And secondly, jealousy tends to be an indication of some underlying emotional issues that I need to work on. And on that note, I'm going to finish this particular podcast, but as I said, we're going to expand on this very important topic, especially attachment styles in relationships, both as parents but also as partners, over the next few weeks. So I'm looking forward to having you join me. Please take this as an invitation. If you have any comments, please leave them. Get in touch with Noir Entertainment and they'll feed it back to me. If there's anything that you want in particular for me to speak about, that's also welcome. So until the next time, take care.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.